Hi, everyone. So my role is to moderate, and as part of it, it's my great pleasure to introduce Leila to you. The introduction is quite extensive and quite long, but I think you should bear with me because every aspect of the biography is meaningful and important. So, Leila Farsakh is the professor of social science at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She is the editor of Rethinking Statehood in Palestine, Self-Determination and Decolonization Beyond Partition, which was published in 2021. And she's the author of Palestinian Labor Migration to Israel, Labor, Land and Occupation, which was published in the second edition in 2012, as well as the co-editor of the Arab-Jewish Questions, Geographies of Engagement in Palestine and Beyond, that was published in 2020. She has also published widely on the political economy of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and alternative to partition in Israel-Palestine in a wide range of academic journals and other venues, including, and this is non-academic venues such as the London Review of Books, Le Monde Diplomatique, Al-Shabaka and Jadaliyah, among many others. Before joining academia, she has worked with a number of international organizations, including the OECD in Paris, and she holds a PhD from the University of London and an MPhil from the University of Cambridge in the UK in 2001. Finally, she won the Peace and Justice Award from the Cambridge Peace Commission in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So it's really a great honor to have you here, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Omer, and thank you, Nitsan, for inviting me. Thank you all for being here. The title of my talk, as I explained to Omer, is about the one-state solution in the aftermath of the war on Gaza. As you all know, the brutal attacks on Israel on October 7th not only shook Israel and the world, but also the Palestinians. The ability of Palestinian militant groups to break through the siege imposed on Gaza for over 16 years, killing 1,139 Israeli and kidnapping 250 who were brought back into Gaza, reflected not only a major intelligent failure on the part of a state that prides itself as a pioneer in surveillance technology, but also a major policy failure, the failure of Israeli policy of containing the Palestinians behind walls as a way to ensure Israeli security. The October 7th attack exposed the fragility of Israel, despite the quadrupling of its per capita income since 1993, its growing military-industrial complex, and its full integration into the global economy. The fact that these attacks were carried out by those many Israeli officials described as human animals must have added insult to an injury to a state that considered itself as an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism, as Herzl described it in 1896, and Israel's latest president, Isaac Herzog, reiterated in similar terms on December 5th, 2023. Israel's response to Hamas and the people of Gaza thus could not be but brutal, even genocidal, not only because Israel's image of itself as the protector of the Jewish people was shattered, but also because its ability to protect its own citizens, which is the foundational responsibility of any state, has been shaken. The extent of the violence Israel unleashed on the Palestinians since October 8th is incomprehensible to both Palestinians and those who know nothing about the conflict. To many observers, it is counterproductive, vengeful, over the top, according to President Biden. It is intended, according to Netanyahu, to petrify the Palestinians back into submission by subjecting them to carpet bombing, the destruction of 70% of Gaza's housing, 90% of its hospitals, destroying the 12th university that it had, and displacing 1.5 million Palestinians who are forced into exile, another exile. More than 30,000 Palestinians have been killed so far, 40% of them children. And meanwhile, daily Israeli incursions into the West Bank have killed around 380 Palestinians and imprisoned 7,300, while that daily Jewish settler violence continues unabated. The question that is confronting us today is, how are we to understand this war? Is it true that it caused a seismic shock in the way we understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or has it simply provided a horrific manifestation of its underlying causes? Does this war have the potential to cause a paradigm shift in how we understand the conflict that has been managed for 30 years and pave the way for a new solution? Or will it return us to the old or worse status quo ante? Is it utopian, if not irrational, to talk about the need for a one-state solution after all the massacres and the traumas that have been unleashed on both sides so far? How can one even dare to talk about a one-state solution in which 7 million Israeli Jews and 7 million Palestinians can live in peace and security with equal rights after the incredible amount of violence that has been unleashed? Who among the Palestinians will want to live with an Israeli, the Israeli who has either participated in the killing of 33,000 Palestinians, has condoned the violence, or remained silent about the ongoing famine or scale of destruction? Who among the Israelis would want to live with a Palestinian, let alone consider their humanity after the atrocities of October 7th and the way the Israeli media is unabashedly supporting the Nakba of Gaza, and when past trauma of the Holocaust triggered seemed to justify the starvation of Palestinian children in the name of Jewish self-defense? How, in a war that Netanyahu described as a fight against a biblical Amalek, a war of light against evil, can we have the audacity to speak about the one-state solution? It's a challenge, I do not deny it. However, I believe it's necessary because we have entered a new phase of the conflict because of this war. A phase that does not change the conflict's settler colonial character, but does shake the foundation of the Oslo peace process signed in 1993. This war brought us back to the starting point of the conflict, to the 1948 moment, when Israel was created and 2/3 of the Palestinians were expelled from their home. It is bringing us to another Nakba, another ethnic cleansing, another war of independence, as Israeli Prime Minister described it, but on steroids this time, broadcasted in daylight, and most importantly, at a different historical juncture. This is a juncture in which Palestinian existence is no longer denied, as it was in 1948, nor is Israel's right to exist questioned by either the PLO or Arab countries, many of whom had signed normalization agreement with the Jewish state. Yet, the foundational question that was posed in 1947, if not before, is still with us. Namely, who has the right, who has political rights in the land between the river and the sea, and how are these political rights going to be exercised and protected? Can this land accommodate two national groups, and if so, how? Under what political configuration? Or are we being thrown back into an existential war, a zero-sum game with only one winner? I argue that we are at a historical juncture that demands of us today to address seriously the one-state solution if we are to avoid more wars and traumas. It is necessary if we want to learn from the failure of Israeli strategy of managing rather than resolving its conflict with the Palestinians. It's a strategy that Israel adopted with the signing of the Oslo peace process in 1993, a strategy that the October 7th event and the war on Gaza that followed is clearly seeking to redefine. I think it is inevitable today to talk about the one-state solution for three main reasons. First, I believe we have to talk about it because a one-state reality already exists. One that many scholars have described as an apartheid reality, given that Israel is the only sovereign power with power over the life and death of the 14 million people living between the river and the sea. Secondly, I believe it's important to talk about the one state because all discussions taking place about how to end the present Hamas-Gaza war, Hamas-Israel war, right? are not seeking to change this apartheid reality. Instead, they are offering a pathway to statehood, Palestinian statehood, despite its territorial impossibility. The prospect for success of what is being professed as a two-state solution is, in my view, as aspirational as any discussion of a pathway to a viable Palestinian state. And thirdly, I believe the rupture and the unfathomable cost caused by the present war is creating new opportunities that make the one-state solution politically more possible and important. So let's go into the notion of the apartheid state, the one-state reality. The notion that Israel is an apartheid state is, of course, contested by many Israelis, even if many scholars and various human rights organizations, including B'Tselem, have confirmed it. Many contend that Israel never wanted to create an apartheid reality, a contention I agree with. since Zionism has historically been more interested in negating Palestinian presence and expelling the native from the land than actually in dominating them. The fact of the matter, however, is that the Palestinians did not vanish nor give up their internationally protected rights. Palestinians have asserted their political agency and the right to self-determination most clearly through the PLO in the aftermath of the 1967 war. Okay, while the debate continues among some scholars over the applicability of the apartheid analogy to describing Israel within its 1948 borders, it is less contested when addressing the reality in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, especially after 1993. The choice of 1993 as a demarcation year might appear as counterintuitive, since that's the year when the PLO and Israel signed the peace accord. This peace process was supposed to pave the way for ending Israeli occupation and reaching a final status agreement that would have created a Palestinian state, as was discussed during the Camp David negotiations in 2000. These negotiations failed, and I show you one of the maps. The middle map is the map of the Palestinian state offered in Camp David, as we could construct from the various proposals. So these negotiations failed, but the idea of a Palestinian state, and with it the two-state solution, became the internationally endorsed solution, as reiterated by the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002 and Roadmap to Peace in 2003. This Roadmap to Peace, very important because it was spearheaded by the United States and the EU, considered the creation of a Palestinian state with provisional border as the only way to ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Palestinian state, though, never materialized, despite its recognition by 137 states and its admission into the UN as a non-state member in 2012. This is largely because Israeli occupation continued to deepen, as best seen with the tripling of settlements population in the West Bank and Gaza. As you see in this graph, over the past 30 years, the settler population increased from around 220,000 in 1993 to 730,000 in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. The Palestinians have found themselves, ever since 1993, increasingly locked out in population reserves. Sorry. Here, this is the map of the West Bank. And it shows you how the West Bank has been divided into the yellow area, the Palestinian population areas that are cut by the blue lines, which are the bypass roads used by Israeli settlers. And the yellow dots are the checkpoints that connect the Palestinian areas to one another. And if you are interested to see in the size of the settlements, the blue dots are the settlements, the number of settlements, a total now of 144 settlements in the West Bank. And they're connected together with this gray area, includes all the area that's under Israeli control. This is the Jordan Valley that Israel has said in any discussion of a Palestinian state will be demilitarized and under Israeli control, more or less. And this leaves you that Palestinians in the West Bank have control over less than 46% of the West Bank. And as you see, it is fragmented. That's why I call it Bantustans, because its population reserves encircled by ever-growing number of Israeli checkpoints, out of which Palestinians cannot exit without a permit issued by the Israeli military authorities. This apartheid structure set in place is premised on the notion of separation between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. It has a territorial and demographic dimension, as seen with the web of settlements, bypass roads, and checkpoints revealed in this graph. But this apartheid reality is also being sustained by the legal edifice that Israel has institutionalized since the signing of the Oslo peace process. This legal edifice consists of 4 different legal regimes. There is the democratic regime that includes and protects all Jewish Israeli citizens over all other groups. There's a second legal regime that governs the Palestinian citizens of Israel, one that recognizes their individual political rights as citizens but denies them their collective rights. And the Israeli nationality law of 2018 confirmed this legal separation when it affirmed the right to self-determination as Israel trust to the Jewish people. Then we have a third legal regime prevailing under Israeli sovereignty, which is the one governing the Palestinians in the West Bank. This is a legal regime composed of Israeli military orders and civilian laws issued by the Palestinian Authority and meant to control and manage the Palestinian population in the West Bank. And then we have a fourth legal regime, which is the one used on the Palestinian living in East Jerusalem. These have residence right in Israel, but have no citizenship right and no political representation within the Palestinian Authority. And last and not least, is the legal system governing the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, one that has left them to Hamas to rule over the population, while Israel controls the borders and anything that gets in and out of the Strip. So the one-state apartheid reality that Israel created, and which confirms this one reality we're in, was made possible by a Zionist ideology of territorial expansion and demographic separation. Its structure built and maintained by the settler movement and the Israeli army. It has evolved in response to Palestinian resistance as much as to the Israeli right's rejection of any notion of Palestinian sovereignty. It has been institutionalized with the Oslo peace process and the failure to implement the two-state solution. This one-state apartheid reality is also sustained by the international community that has accepted the priority of Israeli security over international law or Palestinian rights. Its logical conclusion is the event of October 7th and the ongoing genocidal war in Gaza. So what is unfolding under our eyes right now with this war that has entered its 7th month appears to be transcending this apartheid reality. It's leading us maybe to an abyss we never thought possible. The question that is being posed in front of us is, how will this war end this apartheid and what comes after it? Will the day after of this war usher an end to the apartheid structure of domination, or simply redefine it in more nefarious way while continuing to pay lip service to the two-state solution? I think the Israeli right has clearly expressed what its plan for the day after is: elimination of Gaza, destruction of any possibility of a Palestinian state. The Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and his right-wing government has clearly said that only a Jewish state can exist between the river and the sea. This means that Palestinians can either voluntarily leave or accept Israeli subjugation. This is to be dominant in Israel today. While some Israelis continue to argue that a demilitarized Palestinian state that cooperates with Israel is the most judicious way to protect Israeli security, the Israeli right argues that only fear, force, and more settlements will protect Israeli. The Israeli right, its goal is to maximize Palestinian exclusion by every measure possible. The violence entailed in this Israeli scenario will be probably unbearable, but the likelihood of it succeeding remains dim. I don't think the Israeli right will succeed in their vision, despite their strength. This is largely because Israel is unlikely to be able or to succeed in displacing, let alone eliminate, 5 million Palestinians who are presently living in the West Bank and Gaza. Not if it wants to remain a democratic state, and not if it wants to remain part of an international order that, whether we like it or not, still rejects and forbids any notion of, say, genocide, apartheid, or settler colonialism. The other scenario being proposed right now is by the international community, spearheaded by the US, the EU, and Arab countries, and runs, of course, counter to this Israeli scenario. The United States and its regional partner is proposing a roadmap for the day after that remains within the confine of the Oslo peace process, while adhering to the international consensus on the two-state solution as the only way forward. It is proposing the maintenance of a reformed Palestinian Authority that will be responsible for law and order in the West Bank, while continuing security coordination with Israel. Under this international scenario, Israeli acknowledgement of a Palestinian state is the goal and is in Israel's interest. It would come with Israel's full integration into the region, since Saudi Arabia has made its normalization with the Jewish state impendent on Israeli recognition of a Palestinian state. Such a normalization would in turn pave the way for many Muslim states, regionally and worldwide, to follow suit, ensuring thereby that Iran is contained and Israel no longer a pariah state as it is becoming today. The US right now is, of course, seeking to find Israeli partners who would buy into this scenario. One that still gives leeway to the content and scope of whatever Palestinian state will be recognized. Such a state would surely have control over the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza. What remains unclear, though, is how much control it will have over Palestinian land in the West Bank and Gaza. In other words, will this Palestinian state that is being promoted and we're still debating whether the US will recognize it, will whatever Palestinian state be recognized? Will it include East Jerusalem? Will it encompass Area C, which I just showed you, which includes 56% of the West Bank? Okay. Will it include the bypass roads that dissect the Palestinian areas? And will it include the 500 settlers living in the West Bank? Forget that, those who are living in East Jerusalem. Whoever in Israel is likely to support the idea of a Palestinian state is unlikely to demand the removal of settlements or the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Area C, let alone allow full Palestinian control of its border with Jordan. The Israeli government, be it on the right or on the left, conceptualizes Palestinian self-determination to mean Palestinians ruling by themselves within the confine of Israeli security. The most generous Israeli understanding of what a Palestinian state means does not entail acknowledging its right to self-determination, its right to territorial sovereignty. Such a state, were it to be recognized in Israel, would thus remain part and parcel of the apartheid structure that led to this war in the first place. So how do we get out of the impasse we're in? We're just going in circles around the same thing, right? So are we then closer to the one-state solution, given the impossibility of the two-state solution? Those arguing that the only way to end this apartheid reality is to establish a democratic state, be it binational or any other configuration, have often been described as delusional. While this might be true, I think the war in Gaza has shown that the two-state solution is just as aspirational, if not delusional, as the one-state solution, given that there is no international will to implement a two-state solution, to force Israel to end occupation, to dismantle settlements, or to adhere to international law. So here I'd like to say a few things about the democratic one state. Okay. First of all, I want to say that this is not a new idea. If you look at it historically, and I think history can be helpful for us to understand, not because it can be repeated, but to understand how other people thought about this problem. I mean, the idea of a democratic state goes back to the British Mandate, believe it or not, despite the incorporation of the Balfour Declaration in it. Because the British Mandate, which defined the boundaries of Palestine, created the notion of Palestinian nationality, had been, Golda Meir and others have carried passports called Palestinian passport at the time, okay? The British Mandate dealt with Palestine as a single territory, as a single territorial and political entity, at least up until 1937. Only then, with the Peel Commission, was the idea of territorial separation to resolve Zionist and Palestinian national claims over Palestine considered. The British Mandate, though, never adopted the recommendation of the partition plan of the Peel Commission. To the end of its rule, the British Mandate dealt with Palestine as a single, if divided entity, one that could be transformed into a binational state structure. Such a vision was expressed by many Zionists who were part of the Brit Shalom movement in the 1920s and Ehud in the 1940s. While their vision of these binational Zionists did not garner much support among many Zionist Jews or Palestinians before 1948, the idea of a unitary solution was resurrected again by the PLO in a new version, before it was again abandoned in 1988 when the PLO recognized Israel. The idea of a unitary solution resurfaced again by the early 2000s, once it became clear that the Oslo peace process will not bring about a two-state solution. In this regard, I would like to point out to two figures that maybe people, who I think were influential in the debate on the revival of the one-state idea. And these are Edward Said and Azmi Bishara. They are perhaps the most prominent figures during the Oslo years, talking about the necessity of talking about a binational state in Palestine. Edward Said highlighted the failure of the Palestinian political project of independence in the West Bank and Gaza because of the Palestinian leadership acquiescence to the dictate of Oslo that did not end the occupation. Azmi Bishara, on the other hand, was one of the first ones who called on Israel to become a state of all its citizens, pushing it to change from within by exposing the irreconcilable contradictions of wanting to be both Jewish and democratic. The collapse of the Camp David peace negotiations in 2000 and the consolidation of the Israeli right in power since 2001 made the argument of the one-state solution appealing to a whole range of activists more than ever before. Now, the one-state solution has been presented both as an ethical and a political solution. It guarantees equal rights to all those living on the land and offers the means to recognize Jewish and Palestinian right to self-determination. What is appealing in it politically is that it defines sovereignty as lying with the people, not requiring clear territorial demarcations. It is premised on an understanding of politics as entailing cooperation between people, not separation. And most importantly, it defines the state in less nationalistic terms and more in integrative terms, in the sense that it considers the state a juridical, not national order that is deliberatively constituted. But it's also to remember that early and present protagonists of the binational state or one-state solution never made their case just on ethical grounds. They have always emphasized the political expediency of a one-state solution. So, for example, Eude Magnus, who's among those who most remembered among the binationalists before 48, argued that the Jewish nation does not need a state to exist or flourish. He always said Jewish nation exists before the state, after the state. It's not the state that will determine the existence. And he called for a Jewish state, he argued, in 1947, would be created through might, not right, given that Jews only represented 1/3 of the population in 47. In other words, the legitimacy of the state would be called into question as we see today. A call for a Jewish state, Magnus prophesied, would be built through war, thus endangering, not protecting Jewish lives. And it would be destined to be living in continuous fear of annihilation because it is built on might, not right, and living in a hostile area. History has proved the early binationalists to be correct, to the dismay of many people, I think. As Hannah Arendt argued, a Jewish nation state is neither the answer to anti-Semitism nor the guarantor against acts of genocide, since inherent to any nation state is the fear of a non-national, of the other, living within. And taken to its extreme, a national state can conduct genocide in the name of protecting its own people. So present-day proponents of the one-state solution, mostly Palestinians, take their cues less from Magnus and Brit Shalom and more from the failure of the partition paradigm. Their strongest argument is like, look guys, we tried partition for 30 years and it did not work. Okay? Not for lack of will, not for lack of Palestinian will, but more lack of Israel will. So far, their political work has focused on two main strategies. The first is more conceptual legal strategy that seeks to exert pressure on Israel from outside its borders by trying to unravel the settler colonial essence of the Zionist project and Israel. And the other movement, or the other strategy, is more grassroots and based on mass mobilization, one that tries to create the conditions for changing the nature of the Israeli state from within. So at the conceptual level, present-day proponents of the one-state solution have been effective in unraveling the impossibility of the two-state solution and reframing the conflict back to its settler colonial origin. Their focus is on redefining the terms of the debate as being a struggle not towards statehood, but towards liberation. The focus is on decolonization, and the meaning of decolonization is not statehood as such, but more equal rights for all. Various groups have organized educational campaigns, media literacy, outreach, mass demonstration, mostly based in the diaspora, to highlight the legitimacy of and support for Palestinian rights. They've also turned to using legal strategy to litigate the apartheid nature of the Israeli regime, both to expose the discriminatory essence of the Jewish project and to hold Israel accountable to international law. I think the South Africa's case against Israel at the ICJ in January 2024 is perhaps the culmination of this conceptual legal strategy that has been developing over the past 20 years. It represents a powerful example of the type of pressure being exercised from outside, from a growing coalition within the global South to end Israeli apartheid. Within Israel, on the other hand, we also see various groups are working to change the Israeli polity from within. The scope of their political activism and aim varies. So some groups are more focused on reforming Israeli politics, while others are more focused on wanting to transform Israel into a democratic state inclusive of all. So groups such as the Popular Movement for a One Democratic State, established in 2013, and more recent, a more visible one, the One Democratic State campaign in 2008, their goal is really to generate support among Israelis and Palestinians to transform Israel into a democratic state for all, to abandon its emphasis on the Jewishness without denying the Jews their right to self-determination, but to emphasize the democratic essence of the state. Others, such as groups like Standing Together, accept the nationalist attachments of Israelis and Palestinians while calling for the end of the occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. The goal of these groups is not so much to intervene in the two-state, one-state. Their goal is more to uphold the principle of political equality within Israel, to push for a more democratic accountability and polity that is not beholden to a small elite of right-wingers or capitalists, as they call it. Another grassroots group that has been gaining publicity lately is the One Land for All. This is a group that considers itself to propose a more realistic solution, one that builds on the international recognition of the State of Israel and the State of Palestine, even if these two states are not equally sovereign or independent. He said, let's take this recognition and make something out of it, which I think is a good approach. You don't deny history, how are you gonna build on what you've achieved? Okay. Their argument is that instead of demanding territorial demarcation of these two states, it is effectively paved the way for a one-state solution by pushing for a two-state solution, as paradoxical as this might seem. The One for Land All movement argues that by Israel recognizing a Palestinian state, we move in the right direction because this recognition of the Palestinian state does not require demarcating borders or dismantling settlements. It would entail Palestinian and Israelis recognizing their respective collective and individual rights, including the right of return, both for Israelis and Palestinians, but without dividing the land. There would be no checkpoints. How it would be so lovely to live without checkpoints, it would be so lovely to be. No bypass roads, everybody can use all the roads. Only one single legal system protecting the Palestinians within a single economy, which already we have. If there's one thing we still have is the one single economy. Each state would be in effect a national collectivity that has political economy and a political autonomy and self-rule within a de facto confederated system that takes over foreign and defense policies. For such a confederated system to exist, though, both Israelis and Palestinians need to face the present reality and acknowledge their equal rights. The balance of power domestically and regionally would need to favor such a configuration. I argue also that the revival and the redefinition of the Palestinian national project beyond statehood is going to be central to push or for fermenting forces pushing for the one state. Yet, it's also true that a generational shift has been taking place among Palestinians and Israelis who are promoting the discourse of right, a discourse that is proposed to a unitary state. The core issue is that whether this new generation will be able to force Zionism to face its crisis and help Zionism to redefine itself in a future that promises a binational state. This is by no means an easy task, since for most Israelis and many Jews, Zionism remains a project of national salvation, not just settler colonialism. Although the founding fathers of Zionism, be it Herzl, Jabotinsky, or Ben-Gurion, had no qualms about admitting that the colonial dimension of their project, the Israeli state is presently working on criminalizing any criticism of Zionism and of Israel as being anti-Semitic. The challenge for those advocating for a one-state solution is to explain to Israelis that acknowledging the settled colonial essence of their state does not mean that they are denied political rights. It simply means that their rights cannot be privileged or superior to other rights, the rights of other people. This is not an easy task, not in a world where nationalism and political identity politics shape the discourse of right and power. It requires that Israelis face their history, redefine the national project, and give up their privileges. This is particularly difficult in times of existential fears. However, it is unavoidable if Israelis and Palestinians want to remain on the land as equal and avoid further war and destruction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leila. Let's open it for discussion. Yes, please, if you could,
please speak to the mics and introduce yourself.
and if you could introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Andrew. I'm an undergrad studying history and international and public affairs here. I'm in Professor Bartov's class. And I thought this talk was very interesting. I was wondering if you could address kind of some roadblocks that are still in my head to be fully convinced. And the first one is kind of like, you kind of touched on this with the grassroots organizations, but I'm curious what you say to like what, polling and of Israelis and Palestinians, overwhelmingly, for example, don't want land for all. They still think in this two-state solution mindset. So I'm curious what you say to that. And as well, what you say to kind of, it's almost assumed in like the international community and in kind of the establishment that two-state is what we're going for. That's like the assumption in a way. And I know in academia it's more, debated. And I'm curious kind of how we shift away from this idea like within the political establishment to include one state or confederation or what have you. And then lastly, the last kind of roadblock in my head is kind of the Arab world itself that seems to be going in a different direction now. And Saudi Arabia has October 7th kind of changed things, but you kind of saw a lightening of rhetoric a little bit from the Saudis in terms of what they would be willing to accept to normalize with Israel. So I'm just curious if that trend kind of that Saudi-Israeli normalization deal kind of starts up again, does that pose any problems for future peace?
Do you want to take it one by one? Or should
We
we
have
take
some time, so we can take one by one.
Okay. Thank you very much. So yeah, definitely that's the dilemma that we are in, right? Because we have an international legal structure since the partition plan in 1947 that says the solution to Palestine is partition, right? Is separating. And if you look at the history of the conflict over the past 75 years, actually we evolved from this two-state solution, meaning Palestine and Israel, right? So we have this legal framework, we have all the international support of the Palestinian state, but we don't have a Palestinian state on the ground. So what does a Palestinian state mean? I think we reached a point whereby we need to understand what does a Palestinian state mean. If you mean Palestinian state, Palestinian managing themselves by themselves, but without sovereignty, that's what you have. But this is not called a state, this is in fact a Bantustan. You can call it a state as much as you want, but in fact it's not sovereign. So the roadblock to the two-state solution is Israeli settler colonial system of government. I mean, and it's a big problem for Israel. I cannot deny it. I mean, if I put myself in, Israel had an excellent opportunity in 1993 to say, okay, this is the border, this is a Palestinian state, this is an Israeli state, right? Israel chose otherwise because for good or for worse, once Baruch Goldstein killed these people, Muslim praying in just 5 months after the Oslo process. And then another settler killed Rabin in November 1995. This is an indication that the Israeli society is either beholden to the settler movement or is more on the right than we thought it was. Okay? So, and the political choice has been to expand more settlement, not reduce settlement. I will spare you how many talks, here on the minority. In 2000, 2003, the Geneva Initiative, all the initiatives to try to rescue this two-state solution in all various ways. The last attempt was in 2008 under Harmon. So I think there has been many people committed to two-state solution, but there's nobody willing to exert pressure to create it. So let's accept it has been tried, and it failed. And it failed because Israel was not stopped from expanding its colonial expansion. So I think now any talk about the two-state solution is people trying to buy time until they understand what else is going to happen. What are the on-the-ground This is why this war was so scary, right? Because how on earth some people who are locked in one of the most fortified siege break and shake the foundation of Israel in such a way? This is like an example of this doesn't work. We need to find a different solution. So, but historically, if you look at it, it happened in other places. Look at South Africa. Although, I mean, of course, there's limit to the viability of any comparison, okay? But what I mean by it is that you need to think about how you're going to proceed. Are you going to proceed by always denying the other rights, or are you going to try to emphasize and create a new political platform? But a new political platform does not happen like this. It's not somebody wakes up one day and say, well, I have a platform for the one state I saw, you know. It's the work of the past 20 years. It's the work of how we're going to translate this war. Will this war lead to more people? Of course, this war right now, nobody wants to see the face of the other. I understand. Palestinians, who is most supportive of a two-state solution? Those who are in the West Bank and Gaza. But the way they look at it is that, but they're also not aware, like, how can I have a state with this? Just tell me, how can I have a state with this? So I came to the conclusion that the only way how you can, any talk of a two-state solution is a waste of time, and it's a way of emphasizing the logic, the state logic, and every state logic is based on the survival of the state. Okay? I think Israel has a big problem because it cannot solve the Palestinian problem. It thought it had a solution, and the solution it has right now is just make them again a humanitarian crisis so that they don't discuss any political issue. But the fact of the matter is that you have 7 million Palestinians, 7 million Israelis. So the way I see it, I do not worry about the fact that Poland is in favor of a two-state solution. I do not worry about Saudi Arabia willing to normalize with Israel. I actually think, okay, normalize with Israel. It just again proves the state logic, right? Every state is concerned with its own survival, its own power. The question, can the state survive by oppressing others? And we know from history it does not work. So this is why, although I had my reservation over the one land for all, I really see that the most promising two-state solution, you know, is that says, okay, we will not have borders, but we're going to have a confederate state. Okay, and of course, a confederate state has to pass by you first recognizing a Palestinian state, you Israel, right? But on the ground, I don't see how you're going to create two states. It can only be a confederate or a federate, ideally. But for that to happen, you need to emphasize, this is why the conceptual and the discursive and the legal setting is very important. Because the conceptual is going to emphasize, we want equal rights. Is the conceptual that going to emphasize, yes, you are a colonial state, you're not just a settler colonial state, but you're also a settler colonial state. I think that's the hardest thing for Zionists and Israelis, like, how can I be a settler colonial state? This is my promised land, this is my, you know. And to that I said, yeah, of course, it is your home, it is your, but it is as much a project of national salvation for the Jews as it is a settler colonial project. And I think these two things need to be contended, but this is a debate to happen by Israelis, with Jews, you know. But I think that's the way you go ahead, is like, I think this is why standing together is a group that does good work, because it is emphasizing within Israel the importance of equality, the importance of accountability. Because also what we learn from history is that usually states don't vanish unless there is a war. States either adapt or don't adapt. Okay? South Africa, America, look at the state of United States of America. We were a quite racist state, right? The United States was a quite racist state, but the United States still. Okay, but this disenfranchised blacks, right? Blacks have no rights. Okay, but it evolved to become more inclusive. It evolved. So I think that's something that we need. I mean, of course, in our case, it's more diplomatically difficult because we don't have a constitution that promises the American Constitution. But I want to say that South Africa is a state also that adapted. South Africa not collapsed, but it adapted. It changed from an apartheid state to a democratic state, to the rainbow nation. So I think that's where we are at a juncture where this is possible. Not easy, but possible, because, I mean, we've been in this for 75 years.
Yes, please.
So what is
Can you speak to the mic and introduce yourself?
I can't hear you.
Can you switch it on?
There you go. Yeah, that would work. Don Brancati, I'm a political scientist at the Watson Institute. What you're describing in terms of a one state is kind of broad strokes about rights and sovereignty. And I'm just wondering if there are plans that are more specific about the types of institutions that would be adopted in terms of electoral systems, et cetera, at this point, because what type of institution is adopted has very different effects, even as narrow as where you cut the district lines or where you cut the federal border. So I'm curious to know if there is any discussion on what those plans look like.
Okay, so the discussion about voting and all that is still premature. I mean, I know of some various attempts to explain the various possible constitutional form of a one state. In my book, Rethinking Statehood, there's a chapter on the various constitutional shape of such a state. Would you go for a confederal system? Would you go for a federal system? What do you learn from the system in Canada, for example? So there are discussions of what constitutional shapes you can have. We have plenty of that, and we have so many legal experts that can tell you it can totally become a democratic binational state without copying the same exact problems of Belgium. It could be something on the model of Switzerland. The models are there. The stumbling block is the political will. And what is cutting at the political will is the partition paradigm. I think this is why most of the work right now is that you need to accept that partition did not work, and you need to think differently about political rights. And this is something that the Israeli government, at least, is definitely not considering in any way. So I think the work over the next, if you're asking how is the work over the next 10 years, I think the work over the next 10 years is precisely to say, are we going to go to a confederal state or not? I think that's what is important. Like, if you ask me practically, you'd have to say, will Israel accept a Palestinian state? And once it accepts a Palestinian state, what is the consequence of the state? So it's the election and all that, I think, one is premature. You have first to accept that the other is equal, and you need to rule with them before you get to how we're going to rule together.
It may be premature, but whether or not the one state works does depend a lot about the design of that institution, not just confederal or not, but how it's specifically designed. It could work if one confederal form might work and another confederal form might not work.
So the debate
is definitely
but the debate among those who discuss, because there are lots of people who discuss the confederate versus the federal. Well, many people say the confederate is more risky than the federal. Because, for example, people look at Bosnia as an example, and then they say Bosnia did not work because it institutionalized ethnic separation rather than promote integration. So in the Israel-Palestine thing, I see the most important thing is recognizing the right to self-determination to both groups. Okay, I think the emphasizing the binationalism seems to be more successful than others. Okay, so I think you can have totally a binational state with a clean constitution about the right of every group. Many legal scholars advocate a federal system is more viable than a confederal system, like the federal system in Germany. Okay, where you have each area has different, autonomy and taxation capability, but still have something. But again, I think you can have the best model, and it has been presented. The question is, I think the main stumbling block is how we're going to address the issue of Zionism. I really think this is the biggest problem. And it's very hard because Palestinians accepted defeat in a certain way. Palestinians accepted the limitedness of their national project. Okay? Zionism has witnessed a major crisis, and how it's going to react to it. The challenging block is how far will Zionism adapt, or will Zionism become even more rigid in saying we are entitled to this home just for us because it's our only home. And I think similarity can be drawn from South Africa, because Afrikaners also use similar arguments, but not everyone.
Yeah, I'm Rama. I'm also in Professor Barthov's class. Thank you for coming here. It was a great talk. I guess I have a question building off of Andrew's question about polling, which I don't know. It's like very accurate, and I also think that, like you were saying, the most supporters for a two-state solution are in the West Bank, but I also think that the Palestinians really want rights. I mean, right now, a right to exist, but more than that, right? So I think that exists at the same time. My question is then, this sliver of possibility for one state that you're talking about, are we looking at international pressure? Because Netanyahu is like, how are we to like address this? Because with the like current right-wing government. Are we thinking realistically of an international pressure to?
I think both. I think that right now the international pressure is quite big. And the international pressure, what's important about it is not like how it was 20 years ago saying Israel has to stop the war or Israel has a right to war because we are in a post-11, the 9/11 war and what the Palestinians are doing is terrorism. Now, if you look at the juncture we're in historically, it's a bit different because the ICJ case is important not just because it's holding Israel accountable, it also shows that the debate over the conflict is changing. Okay? That this is not a bunch of terrorists, and Israel has the right to defend itself like September 11. I mean, Netanyahu tried, but the September 11 analogy did not work. He really tried to. So I think the international pressure is important insofar as it is holding international law, holding Israel accountable to international law, and also promoting this discourse of apartheid. Again, not to deny Israelis the right, but to explain the limits and danger of the Israeli state structure. Okay, that in the 21st century, you cannot be Jewish and democratic at the same time. You can be totally Jewish, and not democratic, but these contradictions is... So international pressure is very important because international pressure emphasizes the issues of rights, the issue of international law, and that's very effective. That also what's going to be important is the internal and the regional pressure. What is not helping the one-state debate is I'm not too sure that the states in the region are interested in Palestinian rights much. I mean, the states in the region are very much interested in an oppressive regime. Huh? Okay? So, but this is why it tells you again, this is what states want, but what are the demographic changes happening on the ground? What is the new generation? New generations, I'm the new generation who believe in nationalism, okay? The new generation doesn't believe in nationalism. It believes I want to live, I want to fly, I want to travel, I want to be treated with humanity. And what are the institutional structures that are going to guarantee that? So practically on the ground, what's going to happen, what I think needs to happen, that in any part there in Israel, you need to emphasize democratic accountability. Create democratic institutions. Don't create oppressive, corrupt institutions. That's the only way how we can move forward, I think. But it's not like there's a magic trick. I think if you think about it more about that, if there's a movement happening and there's a discursive shift happening, I think that is more helpful to see that we're going in that direction. The question, how would these progressive forces, as I call them, be strengthened or weakened?
Yeah, I'm just going to respond to that. I totally agree. My only issue is that this way of going about it, I think one of the main issue is also seeing Palestinians as an abstraction. And so by emphasizing to Zionists and the Israeli government that first their policy is contradictory and a liability to their own state, doesn't solve the problem, which I see in the US too when there are articles about the war being a liability to the US, doesn't solve the problem that Palestinians are seen as an abstraction. But
Palestinians have always been an abstraction. That's a very good point. Palestinians have always been considered when you have state logic. That's the problem of state logic versus people's logic. In a state logic, Palestinians have always been a nuisance. And what is incredible about the Palestinians, how despite being a nuisance, they managed to assert themselves that they exist and they have political rights. I mean, Israel with the war in Gaza, what is Israel doing with the war in Gaza? Is making Palestinian question again a humanitarian question, not a political question. You Palestinians be busy with trying how much water you're going to get in, how much food you're going to get in. Who's going to think about self-government when you are in a famine or in a pandemic, right? So I think that this is where we go about the state logic versus people's logic. And also, again, building on what we have. I mean, the international community, everybody, including many Israelis, are aware that Palestinians need to have a state. But it's just when you see this, what shocks me is that how can Israelis not see this? All the progressive Israelis, which are for a one-state, two-state solution, they tell you, of course we can have a Then you tell them, look at this, how are you going to move any settler? Just we had a quarter of the settlers we had now, and Rabin was killed. Imagine somebody wants to move 100,000. We are in a different reality, so that's what we need to. So, am I being quoted? If I'm not being quoted, I'll say what I say, but My advice to the Israelis is like, you have the best chance to keep power. Just go and push for a one-state solution that keeps you in power. Yeah, right? I mean, like happened in South Africa. Do you see what I mean? It's a question of, yeah, it's a challenge, but I just think you're wasting your time continuing to talk about partition and two states. We bypassed it, khalas. We achieved, the value of the two-state solution was to emphasize that Palestinians have political right to a state. We achieved that. Materially, we cannot implement it because the cost is too high, so how do we proceed? And it could also proceed that we continue like this for another 20 years. It could be very well that people are proposing, Israel is proposing, we continue like this for more, because we can have, look, we have Abbas willing to manage this area. We have Arab countries willing to finance this area. We can continue like this. But my advice, given if we study the history of the past 75 years, it's not gonna work.
Thanks. My name is Malcolm. I'm a freshman studying political science.
Wow.
So if the one-state binational solution were to happen, somehow there was the political will, what would the military and security establishment of the one state look like? And how could it ensure the safety of Jews living in the area, given that Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran-backed proxy groups have all expressed explicit anti-Semitism, not against the Israeli state, but against Jewish individuals for their Jewish character? How would you ensure their safety?
Okay, so here we have to be a little bit careful because one is the propaganda, the other thing is the practicality. Okay, so Hamas and Hezbollah, Hamas in particular, it's true, its first charter was very anti-Semitic. But in 2017, they produced a new charter in which they made a clear distinction between Jews and Zionists, Jews and Israelis, and also proposed that they are willing to accept Israel's existence in a two-state solution without any. And the reason why Hamas is not recognizing Israel is not because they believe that Israelis have no, or Jews have no rights. It's more because what is the point of me recognizing Israel? Look at the PLO, it recognizes Israel and got nothing, got this out. Okay, so there is something called the political expediency versus what is really your ideology, right? So I think if you dig really deep about Hamas, it is clear that it is anti-Zionist, but not anti-Jewish. Okay? So their point, how can a binational state exist? I think this is where I say that Israel has an upper hand in trying to shape the shape of this one state. Because in a state in which you acknowledge Palestinian rights, I doubt that Hamas will have much power. Okay? And I doubt, I mean, yeah, they can think in the long term Israel is going to vanish. Okay, in the long term we're all dead. Like, as King said, it's there. I think it's more, they prove to be a party with incredible malleability, if you want, okay? Because they have accepted already things. All along they said we were wanting to have a hudna, right? We want to have a ceasefire. I mean, it comes back, you have to recognize Israel's right to exist. But I think think of it as a question that these recognitions are part of a political calculation. What am I going to gain by recognizing? If I can recognize you as a Jew, as Israel, not a Jewish state, or the right of the Jews to self-determination in Palestine. But what does this give me? Okay, do you recognize also my rights? So I think that's something to bear in mind. The other thing you need to bear in mind is the regional configuration. And here you're very right, because we have now what's called the axis of resistance versus the axis of accommodation, right? And this is really geostrategic politics. Okay, is Iran trying to say I'm still relevant? I assure you, if the US opens relationship with Iran, Iran will accept it. I personally I might be wrong, but it's a question of Iran making sure that we matter and we have a weight and we can disturb or maintain stability depending on how you deal with it. So that's this axis of resistance between two comma. I mean, I'm not talking about Hamas, I'm talking more about Hezbollah and Iran. Is more a way by which certain actors are trying to emphasize their relevance and their importance in the region. And they have the power. That basically you cannot bypass Iran, I think. But that's actually what has been amazing in the US policy since '78, is that it has tried now for nearly 50 years, soon it will be 50 years, of trying to corner Iran, but Iran is still a very important actor. So at what point will you talk with Iran is the question. And this is also why is it an important question, because So you have the regional configuration, but you also have the international configuration. We didn't talk about China and Iran, and China and Russia. The US wanted to retreat from the region, and this war brought it back in. Okay, US wanted to focus on China, but now, so we're gonna see some change. I mean, Iran, Russia and China are fully for Palestinian self-determination, do not consider Hamas a terrorist organization. Don't forget that PLO was also considered a terrorist organization before it was recognized. So these are political calculations, but the overarching logic is state survival and state adaptation. But but I understand the fear about like, okay, they are against the Jews, and they're more against Zionists than against the Jews.
Can I follow?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, I think that it certainly could be the argument for the outward political expression of these groups. But I mean, do you really think that a change in the Hamas charter in 2017 completely shifts the view of Jews in the Hamas group, or do you think that with a binational state that the Houthis won't believe death to or a curse upon the Jews still? I mean,
I think
they might say that to convince the international community, but do you think they really deeply would settle that view?
I think Jews were always part of the Middle East. You have to remember that. Jews were always part and parcel of the Middle East. They were part of Yemen, part of Egypt, part of Syria, part of Lebanon, part of Iraq, very important. So the Jews were always part of the Arab world, okay? And I think the creation of Israel created a rupture in that continuity and a redefinition of that connection. So I don't think the Arab world is against the Jews. What the Arab world is, or the Houthis, or they're more against the oppression of the Palestinian, the privileges, but I think more the oppression. I think it's more the issue of rights, and also the issue, because you're right. I mean, I'm against any fascist, right? Like, you either believe the right of everybody to live. It's not some people versus others. I think you're going to have lots of people, especially people in Gaza. You will find lots of people who are much more accepting of the Jews and Israelis than you would think. Maybe because they had so much trauma at the end, they're like, we're all human beings, we're all mothers, we're all sisters, we're all fathers. Do you understand? I think if you go to the humanity, it's more the political structure. But I want to come back to your point about the military, which is a very good point. Actually, what would be amazing to see is how the generals are much more visionary politically than the politicians. I mean, you talk with some Israeli generals. They're able to deal with Hamas and understand Hamas because they understand the politics, they understand state survival. And they understand that it's a question of, calculations, like Hamas, what happened with Hamas? Hamas proved that if a political party, you cannot win. So you have no choice. You can try to eliminate them. We tried for 6 months. I mean, everybody is shocked, right? Including, and I think no Palestinians would have thought Hamas would have survived this long, for whatever reason. But a military or a political intelligent person, I would argue, tries to make a cost-benefit analysis. Until where do I want to go next? Okay, if I cannot eliminate them, how can I contain them? That was what's done with the PLO. You forget that the PLO was considered the way Israel talks about Hamas was the same language that Begin and others use about the PLO. Shamir, when the PLO recognized Israel in 1988, he used the same language, like a bunch of terrorists, we don't believe them. History proves to you that people adapt. So I understand the fear, but I think this is where we have to confront the fear rather than just hide behind it. Because the central issue is, do you believe in the humanity of everybody, or do you believe in the superiority of one group because you're scared, or because it's your ancestral home, or because you're the eternal victim, or because I think if there's one thing we learned with this war, nobody has a monopoly over the victimhood, and nobody has a monopoly over suffering. Everybody is suffering on every side, and a lot. And the question is, how do we use the suffering to emphasize our humanity, or just defend ourselves whatever the cost? And it's hard. I mean, if I had a solution, I wouldn't be here.
He's been waiting
Okay,
a long
sorry.
time.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My name is Nathan. I'm a first year at Brown. I study applied math economics and international public affairs. I just wanted to sort of go back to what Malcolm was saying. In the 2017 charter, they didn't really call for a two-state solution. What they said is they'd be willing to accept a Palestinian state within the 67 borders, but that they did not recognize the state of Israel, only referring to as, quote, the Zionist entity. And I think in your talk, what was really important is you brought up, you brought up how in Israeli society with the settlement movement, it's a huge issue in terms of actually progressing and making forward. Making progress toward a solution, whether that's two-state or one-state. But current polling shows 90% of Palestinians not only support Hamas, but they supported the October 7th attack. And historically, whether the negotiations and the proposals have been fair to Palestinians, which I think most people would agree they weren't, Palestinian leaders and actors have not been willing to propose any sort of two-state solution in many of the historical negotiations. In fact, and more broadly in the Arab world, there was the three no's, the no normalization, no peace, no negotiation. So do you see, Palestinian society and Palestinian leaders as well as the Arab world as an obstacle just as much as the Israelis, or how would you compare this?
Just one comment, because there was a couple of polls recently, and they're quite interesting. So, in a poll by this post from the West Bank,
Chicago.
Yes, Chicago, that's right. What it shows, which is really interesting, the majority of Palestinians on the West Bank and in Gaza, and God knows how we managed to poll in Gaza, but support the Hamas attack of October 7th, deny by and large that there were massacres or don't want to hear about it. And at the same time, if there were elections, only 30% would support Hamas.
But the polls still show broad approval of Hamas.
No,
You just said they
that's what I'm saying. They said that if there were elections, and you should read the poll carefully because the headlines, especially in the Israeli media, were not saying that. But if you read the poll, that's what the poll says. Only 30% would vote for Hamas. And interestingly, among the Israeli public, it's very similar. Most Israelis, up to now, support the war in Gaza, but do not support the government. They want this government to go, but they support the war. So what you see, and it's not the only area where there's a kind of mirror image of support for acting aggressively against the other side and believing that your leadership is not leading you anywhere that you want to go at the same time.
So first of all, polling, I always take polling with a pinch of salt, because pollings are polling, you're capturing them just in a certain moment, and there's a context for it, okay? But I want to go into your points. First of all, the three no's that you mentioned were in 1967. And 67 is 57 years ago. I think since there's three no's, many things have evolved. So these no's, this is a part of propaganda, not part of facts. Because the fact is, Egypt made peace with Israel. Bahrain and the Emirates signed, normalization agreement with Israel. Jordan has peace with Israel. So the argument that Arab states are not with Israel, I think this has been demystified. Okay? Actually, Arab states know that Israel is here to exist. This was the achievement of 1967 war. This is the essence of 242. People might question the right of Israel to exist, but nobody can question that Israel exists and is a powerful state and is here to stay. Okay? So what people say in propaganda is one thing, what the fact is. Yes. So just a minute. Now, concerning the charter of Hamas, the 2017. Yes, Hamas is, you have to start with the starting point. The starting point is what? Is the starting point the right of Israelis, or is the starting point the settler colonial project? The big problem from the point of view of Hamas and most Palestinians, this is a settler colonial project. Israelis themselves have said it's a settler colonial project. Just take Gershon Shafir, so it's a settler colonial project, not only a settler colonial project, but also a settler colonial project. So when it is a settler colonial project, why would Hamas accept Israel? Because it's a settler colonial project. The Palestinian, that's all your mistake. Palestinian leaders, those who are now in Ramallah, Arafat who died, and now Abbas, who is now the PA president, totally accept Israel, is bending backwards to please Israel. What did he get from pleasing and accepting Israel? He got the tripling of settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. He got the fragmentation of the West Bank and Gaza. What's the point? That's the argument that Hamas has. Okay, we have, if you want to say of the Palestinian leadership, you have two parties. There's one who accommodated Israel and made concession on every single thing the Palestinians cared about. And what did they get? Look, that's what they got. They got this map. And there's another party telling you, well, you know, Israel is very powerful. The only language it will understand if we exert not just compromise, we need also to show their consequences to its action. The fact that the majority of polls of people, Palestinians, support October 7th is because for them, it represents of people rebelling against a siege in which people forget. In the West, in Gaza, you had 80% poverty and 45% unemployment for 16 years. So breaking the siege is a way of saying we still matter, we still live. You cannot forget about us. And you might not like what they did, and you have every right not to like what they did. But if you are an intelligent politician, you need to understand from where it comes and how you're going. Is your objective to really secure Israeli life, or is your objective to remain in power? Because if your objective is to secure Israeli life, you don't put people in prison. Okay? So, I'm not trying to justify. I'm just saying you need to understand how politics functions. So Hamas has proved itself that it is upholding Palestinian national demand, which is we have the right to independence. The Palestinians have right to independence and the right to dignity. Its tools is wrong, it's terrorism, yeah, let's take them to court. But as a politician, if you want to understand the problem, and above all, if you want to solve the problem, you need to understand this is a party that imposed itself, whether I like it or not. It's like the settlers. Settlers impose themselves, whether I like it or not. How do I deal with them? How do I contain them? How do I take away their power? Well, what we realized after 30 years is that Israeli strategy of the past 30 years, the way we take away their power is to fragment them. It did not work. So now figure out what you're going to do. Eliminate 7 million Palestinians or think of another strategy. Yes? Somebody else wants to
follow up?
I just wanted to, my point with the 3 no's was just to give historical background. I wasn't trying to suggest that was the current policy. But Hamas has said that they will repeat the events of October 7th over and over until Israel doesn't exist. And I feel like, I appreciate the context you gave to my question, but do you think that Hamas and Palestinians in general, or just Palestinian leaders in general, really do want to see, or going back to your original contention about a one-state solution, would they really be content to live with Israelis and Zionists? Because
the Palestinian Authority, that's what it proposed. Abbas has reiterated that over and over again. Did it get anything? But Abbas and the PA is the main leadership in the West Bank since 2006. They've said it over and over again. They compromised over and over again. They said we're living with Israelis. Abbas's line is, now Abbas is even blaming Hamas. He said, do you think you're going to liberate people by causing Israeli rage over you in this way? Did Abbas get anything? Netanyahu is still saying there will never be a Palestinian state. So the problem is the leaders, I think, Palestinian leaders are failing the Palestinians. In my view, Abbas is failing the Palestinians more than anybody else, okay? But for every Palestinian who's seeing the situation, saying, where are we right now? We're fragmented, we're cut from one another, we cannot move. Settlers can invade us any moment. What is the Palestinian strategy? Either you leave, which is what Israel is trying to do, or you stay and lay low. But again, this goes back to your point about we need to go beyond the tit for tat, because we're not dealing with equal parties. This doesn't mean that the weaker part doesn't have responsibility. Hamas has responsibility, made mistakes, has to be taken accountable. But you trying to tell me that it's a mistake of people who argue, the 2 leaders failed on both sides. No, it's not 2 leaders failed on both sides. There's one who has the policy, who chose a policy of containment, imprisonment, settlement, and another who's saying, I refuse to die. It's, so I don't know, we're gonna see how it's gonna go, but it's, the level of devastation is beyond conception. What's happening right now is worse than 48. When he said it's a war of independence, okay? Good luck, I don't think it's a war of independence, but it's definitely a worse Nakba than 48. And we are in a century, who still believes that these things should not happen. I think if it happened in the 18th century, maybe it would have passed. But it did not happen in the 18th century. It's happening in 2023, 24. Somebody here wants to ask a question. I don't want to.
Hi, my name is Aaron. I'm a Master's of Public Affairs candidate. First of all, I'd like to say I apologize for coming late. I apologize for that. Secondly, I would like to contest a narrative that I've heard often, frequently stated, and you stated something along those lines, which was that the creation of Israel was, basically instigated a lot of these divisions, and that Jews and Arabs and Christians existed peacefully in the Levant before that. I don't know, I haven't spent my life studying this, but from my understanding, events like the Hebron massacre, pogroms against Jews were organized by Arabs in the region, on a pretty massive scale prior to the invention of Israel. Pretty much as soon as Jews started coming into the region through agricultural funds, through fairly legitimate and peaceful means, immediately, pogroms and organized violence against Jews, and I mean specifically Ashkenazi Jews. I don't mean Mizrahis. Mm-hmm. I don't know the history of Mizrahis in the Levantine as well, but violence against Ashkenazis coming was immediate. So I would contest organized violence against Jews was very well established prior to the creation of Israel. And
okay, so what's your question?
So I'm just saying, I don't think that the creation of Israel was a major catalyst in violence against the Jewish
so here I have to
population.
push back a little bit because historian, and I will use Israeli historian and also non-Israeli historian. So that there was attack on Zionist groups in Palestine. There was. Was it systematic and continuous? No. You just take Bernard Lewis, who wrote a lot about anti-Semitism and wrote a lot about the persecution of the Jews. He said in Muslim countries, the Jews never witnessed the kind of pogroms that existed in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, and the pogrom that happened in Russia and Poland against the Jews. So the history of Ashkenazi Jews in Europe is very different from the history of Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews in the Arab world. They were not treated as equal citizens because you did not have, under the Ottoman Empire, and actually the Ottoman Empire in 1866 introduced the 1854 introduced the Ottoman citizenship, and it gives Jews, Christians, and Muslims the same citizenship. So it's not true that there were systematic pogroms. What has happened with the Zionist project, there were worries about it, but the first pogroms, if you want to call it, is in 1921 and the other one in 1929. And it was not against Jews as Jews, it was against Zionists who were taking Palestinian land. Now, of course, the line between Zionists and Jews get conflated, but I think we need to see it in this context. The big tragedy of Israel, that it was a project built by European Jews on a land which was Arab. And a project also, it's not that the Zionists came and said, we want to live with the Arabs. They want to live on their own. And that was something very new to the region and which met opposition. And I think the latest book by Arish Sabahuri discusses in particular how the very early Zionists, the most Brit Shalom, the most binationalist, actually fostered and how they justified for themselves that they expelled Palestinians and that they witnessed the Nakba and they were part of the Nakba. I think it has to do, I know it's a complicated history because one of the hardest things, I think, for anybody is how could the sweetest dream, the most beautiful project, a project of liberation and emancipation, be done with so much blood? And I think that's the hardest thing, is like we would like to, and I understand it, it's like the October 7th. Many Palestinians want to believe that it was pure, that they just went and killed Israeli soldiers and did not kidnap, and kidnapped only Israeli soldiers and then did not do anything else. That's the narrative you as Palestinians want, because you want to believe that this was a pure act of principled liberation. Okay. But this is not what happened. They did kill soldiers, but they also killed civilians, and we need to confront that. And on the Israeli side, I think the hardest thing is how a place that we called home, we wanted to create to be home, actually was built with so much blood and at the expense of somebody else. And I think so long as we don't confront this history and understand that the answer to it is that, yes, I'm sorry, I built it at your expense and I take responsibility for it. And some people we know, there are movements within Israel that wanted to recognize the Nakba, okay? And said, yes, we had a role in that. That was not possible 30 years ago. Today it is more possible, believe it or not. But I think the next step is you need to acknowledge, just like the Palestinians have to acknowledge the Holocaust, have to acknowledge why did Zionism get created? For Palestinians, for example, the hardest thing has been to accept that yes, Israel is a settler colonial place, but it's also a national project. We have to put these together. But also I think what can help, and I think this is the experience of history, we cannot undo history. We can build on what we have. So this is what we achieved. The question is, can we acknowledge the pain of the past and today acknowledge our both humanity and forge a way together? But we cannot forge a way together if we don't first, each one, face what we think we are, what bad things we did in the past, and what do we believe in the humanity of the other. And that's very difficult to do when you're scared, but that's what should happen.
So if I could ask a follow-up, and I appreciate the way that you framed that response. It does totally make sense. When you and when others use the term anti-Zionist, it is concerning that there isn't a clear universal framework for what that means. And what I mean by that is I consider myself a Zionist. I consider myself a staunch Zionist. I recognize that the Nakba happened. I recognize that it was horrible. I'm not out here, sending Venmo to Hilltop Youth. I think they're terrorists and I think that they should be arrested. I don't support the settlements, but I am a Zionist. I support the existence of Israel. I have no plans to make Aliyah, but I do think that Israel's existence is fundamental and imperative to my safety in the diaspora. I am a Zionist, absolutely, unequivocally. Okay. And yet I recognize all those things. So when I hear the word anti-Zionist, does that mean anti-67 borders? Does that mean anti-48 borders? Does that mean
that's very helpful. Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking that. Because when you say that you're a Zionist, in other words, you believe in Israel's right to exist and that Israel's existence provides safety for you as a Jew and as a Zionist, right? The problem is that from a Palestinian perspective, it's more easy for Palestinians to deal with Israelis, you understand? So somebody who lives in Israel, it's easier to deal with an Israeli than to deal with Zionism. Why? Because Zionism is built on the negation of the Palestinians, whereas Israeli is the product of Zionism, right? So when somebody says they're anti-Zionist, they are against a settler colonial project. They're not against Jews. And there's a debate among Palestinians. This is a very big debate. Okay. Do we acknowledge Zionism? Because if I acknowledge Zionism, I acknowledge a movement that negates my existence. Or do we acknowledge Israelis, which is the byproduct of Zionism? Do you understand? So I wouldn't, it does, if somebody is anti-Zionist, is he against Jews? No. The way Palestinians understand anti-Zionism is being against a settler colonial state, not against Jews who want to live in Palestine in whatever form. So I think if you see it like that, now this might not be a satisfactory answer, but this is why I say it has to be a debate among Zionists. How do we deal with that? And I think right now it's happening because also you're seeing Jews saying, I don't need Zionism. Okay, Zionism was a historical movement, and like every historical movement can either evolve or die. We don't know. It's like Palestinian nationalism also, in my view, completely changed. I mean, what is Palestinian nationalism today? I mean, apart from saying we just want to live on the land and have our life, so I think, ideologies move, but I think it might help anybody, and I wish this can become more mainstream, is that when somebody is attacking Zionism, it's attacking the settler colonial essence of Zionism, not the Jewish people. And it's when you conflate the two together that it becomes problematic. But you do understand that for Netanyahu, it's very important that to conflate the two together.
I know.
Netanyahu is very important to say anti-Zionism means you're anti-Semitic. It's not.
I know he's a revisionist. He's a student of Jabotinsky.
I think Jabotinsky would turn in his grave. I really think, because Jabotinsky said it clearly, we are colonialists, and there's no shame about it because this is the only, and he did say Palestinians will resist us, and they have every right to resist us because there is no colonized people that accept this colonial subjugation. They were aware of it. So the question is, we are not in 1945. We're not in 1930s. We are in 2023. Israel is a strong society, built a lot, is here to stay. The question, how is it going to stay? And that's the question which is confronting Israelis. And what the Palestinians are saying is that they will not accept subjugation, or some of them will not, others have. But we're stuck.
We start at a good time, a good way to finalize this talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.